Welcome to the Ranchers for Tomorrow, the Gatepost, the official podcast of the Arizona Cattle Growers Association, where the spirit of the West meets the future of ranching. Each episode opens the gate to conversations that matter most to the Arizona beef community. Rooted in over a century ranching tradition, this podcast celebrates the men and women who ride for the brand, the producers, family, and the advocates keeping Arizona cattle industry strong. Listeners will hear firsthand stories from the ranchers across the state, the challenges shaping life on the land, insights from ag policy leaders, and updates from the association that represents them. Now, here's your hosts, Nate Brawley and Sydney Connerly.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hello.
So I will start. J.Z. Smith is the principal owner of Cattle Mex, a leading U.S. importer of live Mexican cattle, and the T4 Ranch in Santa Cruz County, Arizona. With over 60 years of experience, J.Z. has established deep-rooted relationships with livestock producers across both the United States and Mexico. Cattle Mex uses the T4 Ranch as its primary receiving and distribution point, allowing the firm to provide a reliable and consistent supply of healthy stocker and feeder cattle throughout the United States when the U.S. border is operational. And also we have Jordan Bell. Jordan Bell, daughter of J.Z. Smith, is an accomplished agronomist and associate professor for Texas A&M AgriLife Research and Extension with a PhD in soil science from Texas A&M University. In her role with the Texas A&M AgriLife, she works directly with farmers and ranchers across the Texas High Plains to improve the production and profitability of forage, grain crops, and cotton in water-limited environments. She recently transitioned to a part-time remote role with Texas A&M AgriLife, providing continued producer support through publications, consultation, and programming. Working from Arizona allows her to work more closely with her family in Arizona and become an integrated part of business interests. So again, we appreciate you both being here. That's a great introduction, and again, we're happy you're here. So my first question, I guess, is I just want to hear from you both a little bit about, we went into it with your bio there, but more about your history. How long have you been in the business? Have you always been in the cattle business? Give us a background and some history into maybe your family and your business.
Well, I'm a fourth or fifth generation rancher and livestock trader. My great granddad, he back in the 1800s, he was a wagon boss for the Cross Ells, which headquartered in Colorado Springs. It ran all the way to Delhart, Texas, and then transitioned once the big snowstorms hit. The big corporates got out of the business, and the little ranchers, had an opportunity to buy some of those ranches. And then going forward, my grandfather was a rancher and a trader and a rancher in Mexico. And that's where we really started buying after the revolution. My family started buying many cattle out of Mexico. We were one of the first ones that ever sent, because of a large drought in the late 20s, early 30s in northeastern New Mexico. They took, they gathered up about 4,000 or 5,000 heifers, and they brought them to Mexico. We kept them down here for 7 or 8 years. That was the start of the Cananea Cattle Company, that those heifers were. And so we've been in this business for a long time, and probably the major part of our business is really backgrounding cattle and then running cattle on pastures and partnering with different people, feed yards, and throughout the United States. I'm very fortunate to have Jordan join me. I'm getting to the age where I'm having a hard time getting around to see everything. But due to this Mexican border closing, we have a lot of time on our hands. In fact, we've got a few cattle left in California turned out. We just sold our last pen of cattle here week before last up at Hereford in the feed yard. I was feeding quite a few cattle in partnerships with Dave Stevenson at Red Rock. Those cattle have all been sold. It's ironic. We were invited to a luncheon up by Coolidge, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
With the Boyles the other day, and I noticed all those cotton fields, and I said, well, I said, we exported the cotton business, I guess it was 50 years ago when we got rid of the spinning mills and everything. We actually exported the cotton business. And it looks to me like we're trying to export the beef business if we're not real careful. Uh, they closed down this border, the feed yard, a lot of these feed yards, packing houses, they were built to the size they are today primarily because of the imported Mexican cattle at 1 million to 1.5 million cattle. You take that away from the industry, and you're going to see some dramatic changes here in the United States. I think if it hadn't been Mr. Trump, if he hadn't came out and said he was looking into these packers, I think we'd already see one major packing house closure, probably two.
Right.
They close those packing houses. They're going to have to do something. It came out here that, Tyson's lost $450 million this year from their beef business. JBS lost 285 million, has lost 285 million. They're the only two public companies that actually we can see what they make and Cargill, I'm sure, has lost money. All these independents, I have a friend right north of San Angelo that's got a little packing house. That packing house has been open two years now. They've never made a penny yet. So, this packing house business is very, very, it's a difficult business. And we're in a difficult business. And in my estimation, if we can't get the government out of our business, we will not have a business in 20 years. We have to get them completely out of our business. I mean, tax-wise, Secretary Rollins, I'm sure she's a nice lady, doesn't know very much about the cattle business. The people that she are listening to is her constituents in South Texas, North Texas. That's those oil people that bought those ranches, but they're not cattle people. They don't have any cattle on those ranches. They got out of the cattle business 15, 20 years ago. And therefore, that's one of the reasons our numbers are going down. It's not necessarily that it's not a profitable business or if you could have made a profit in it, but you let these wealthy people buy these ranches, they don't run cattle on these ranches. That's not their business. They did that in the past and they lost a lot of money, so they decided they'd just to get a depreciation and hold it for whatever, the appreciation in the land. We've got in my estimation, our land is too high in the United States. You have $20,000 farmland you're trying to raise corn on. That doesn't, it's pretty hard to do.
And so it does go to these profit margins. And he talks about how, industry has lost money, especially in recent years. We have been looking at just the rapid fluctuations within the market. But one of the things that my father and I have repeatedly discussed are these break evens. And if you're only operating for a break even, that's a really hard projection. So, we really do have to step back and look at how the industry has changed. And of course, there's repeated discussions about how the cattle inventory has been declining since the 70s. And he is correct that, as we look at a lot of ranches, and especially in other areas, they've transitioned to big game ranches. And hunting's very profitable. And so, of course, when we have looked at the New World screwworm, one of the reasons why the Mexican border was closed is because they do want to protect not just the U.S. livestock industry, but also the game industry. And so as we have stepped back and looked at now what has happened, because we have a very tight cattle supply, we do not have the beef cattle numbers to keep these feed yards operational. Across the Texas High Plains, there are feed yards operating at significantly reduced capacity, in addition to the very few feed yards that are left in Arizona. And so if you don't have the feed or the cattle that are then going to be finished, you're not going to have the cattle going into the packing plants. And at some point, if the packing plants are operating at reduced capacity, what is going to happen? Now, of course, as my dad mentioned, if a packing plant closes, that's hard for the industry. But what hasn't been highlighted here is what about the community where that packing plant is? What about all those employees? What about the jobs? What about the tax base? The cattle that come through the livestock, well, back up. Yeah, my steps. So as we look at the cattle, that come through the whole industry, starting with the ranchers and all the way through, there's that trickle down economic effect. And that money grows every time it changes hands. And there's a broader impact to those dollars. And that's where, as we step back and look at the value of Mexican cattle, we see that those live cattle contribute to not just border industries but the community itself. There's the truckers that come into the community. Of course, there's the buyers. There's the tax revenue that's generated within the community. But then it expands. Cattle from Mexico, and especially the cattle that cross on the Arizona border, go from California to Texas and beyond. And they then, are providing a base for, the feed, the forage industries, jobs in feedlots, and eventually they wind up in packing plants. So it's not just importing box beef, as, Mr. Trump has said, but it's really importing jobs and tax base that goes into our revenue streams. And of course, I will agree with Secretary Rollins. She's 100% right when we talk about food security is national security, but we have to keep in mind, these relationships that we have had with Canada and Mexico have been valuable for over 100 years. And so, we had NAFTA that recently changed in the first Trump administration. Now we're looking at changes and, all the implications from tariffs. But we have to keep in mind, there's this North American agricultural system, and we have a history of that. And Mexican cattle are very important to that, as is the produce industry.
So can I go back, just ask a clarifying question about maybe a decade or so ago, when you guys were really crossing a lot of cattle, what would be an average crossing for you guys as a business, just out of curiosity?
Well, it's really changed over the last few years. I had a real bad accident 6, 7 years ago, and I had to slow down. But we even this last few years, we cross approximately, say 80 to 100,000 cattle a year. Of that 100,000 cattle, we'll retain ownership or in partnerships or by ourselves, probably 30% of those cattle in the feed yards or going to grass or wheat or to the desert. And a lot of that's done with partnerships. So we sell, say, 60, 70% of the cattle. We retain ownership of 30 or 40% in one form or manner. And I see today, and if we're not real careful, we're going to be just like the cotton industry. We're going to export our industry. We're going to export the final stage of our industry. And I think we're getting closer. People say, well, you're wrong, JZ. I said, well, I'm not wrong. When I first really started in this industry, probably in the early 70s, I just came back from service and we had 123 million beef cattle in the United States. And we had 7 or 8 million Holstein. Well, today we still have, say, probably 10, 12 million, probably 10, 11 million Holsteins. And we have probably 35 million beef cattle. That's all we have. So we've lost 70% of our industry already. And it won't take that much more to go right on down. Now you hear all the cattlemen's organizations talking about, well, we're doing such a better job of processing these cattle, raising these cattle.
Yeah, more efficient.
That's pretty good propaganda. But that's not necessarily the truth. We had a lot better product in the early 70s than we have today, due to all the beta agonists and hormones and everything we put in these cattle. Now, I, as myself, as a producer and a user of beef, my daughter, we would just soon take all that away. Almost any feeder you talk to, they'll say, absolutely, take it away. But but they have to use it to be competitive. So there's a lot of things in our industry that will need to change, or we will finally lose another 10 or 15 million of our beef cows, I believe, within the next 10 years. Because this high market is very, very, say for an example, I was just looking at a closeout here. In April, these cattle that we just sold last week, they cost like $2.37. They weighed 707, delivered to the Panhandle. Well, today, those same cattle would cost about 220, about 320. They'd be cheaper than they were in April. That's how much our market came down. 2 months ago, they were 50 cents a pound higher than that. So, this market is really dropped. Our high in this market was really about 6 weeks ago in the box beef, in the cutout. It was like 414 to 427. Well, hell, today I think it's around 375, 370 to 375. So really, when Mr. Trump, he was kind of behind the curve talking about this high-priced beef. The beef had already came down, but it hadn't hit the stores yet. Well, the high-priced beef was just getting into the stores, but that passes through. So we have to be very, very careful that we don't export our business the same way we did the cotton business, and we're pretty close to doing that. They cut off the Mexican cattle, the live cattle from coming into the feeder cattle coming into the United States. They'll build packing houses in Mexico, and then they'll ship the beef here. I see Canada; they're getting a little woozy. They just opened up an office in Singapore this week to sell beef. Prior to that, we were selling all the Canadian beef, but to export. But over 90% of it.
Yeah, the beef that went to Singapore was previously, beef exported out of the US. Now Canada's picking up that market. And so that's what I do think we need to highlight is why should the American rancher care? As a whole, most of the American ranchers are like, we don't care about the Mexican cattle market. But the thing is, if we lose those packers, they also lose their market, because at some point when the packers in the US need fewer beef numbers, well, now that's going to hurt the American livestock producer. And so that's something that we are not addressing. Once we lose the capacity in the feed yards, we have feed yards close and packers close in response to that. Packers are now no longer going to need the number of cattle. And so, that could indirectly impact, the American livestock producer. And so again, once Mexico responds and they rebuild, their industry internally, build their own packing plants, well, we say we need those numbers. Well, at what point we're not sending you cattle? We are no longer in the driver's seat.
Good point. Yeah, that makes a lot
In
of
fact, we'll be sending cattle to Mexico. That might be the future of the cattle business in the United States, is actually sending our cattle to Mexico, because they'll have the last factory to process the cattle.
And and here we are, back to just the cotton industry analogy. We do not mill cotton in the US. All of the US cotton goes to China.
Yeah,
and so
there was a lot of reasons, well, not necessarily just to China, but to Asia. The reason for that, mainly, I think, in those days, was back in the early 70s, in the 60s. The reason that was exported is because of the liability, the insurance. The insurance just got so prohibitive, you couldn't own them then. And I'll never forget, when I came back from overseas, I married my daughter's mother. And they wanted me to have a couple of 2 or 3 nice shirts. So we went to the best place in Amarillo, Texas to buy the shirts. And I'll never forget, those shirts cost $75 or $80 a piece. They were all cotton. I guess if we hadn't got rid of all those tariffs, I guess that same shirt in the United States costs $500 today. If it was produced if that cloth was produced in the United States. So I think we're getting very close to exporting our entire business. Now, I'm saying close, I'm talking about over the next 20 to 30 years. And that's not uh, that's not unrealistic to look at it that way.
Yeah,
And it mainly it's due to our US government. If everything that they do hurts the livestock industry. I mean, you see, well, you got drought insurance. Well, as you know, being here in Arizona, we collected drought insurance too. But I think it's a terrible program. You've got 80% of these ranches have sold out here. They're too expensive for a rancher to buy them. And they were sold for the depreciation value and to collect the drought insurance to pay for the ranch. That's gone on all over the United States, and the price premiums and all that. Every time the government steps in to agriculture, it seems like we take 3 steps back.
Right.
Jordan?
Oh, well, and actually, do you have some other questions to help?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Sydney.
Yeah, so I actually have a question. I wanted to know kind of like the history of what it used to be crossing cattle from Mexico. Like back in the day, how did that go down?
Well, when I was a little kid, I'll never forget, my dad called us. We had a ranch. We used to lease a lot of country up around. Well, we were the only people that ran cattle in northern central New Mexico, up around Chalma, New Mexico, and right next to the Colorado line. And he had been over here to Douglas, Arizona, and they'd bought, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000 steers. But a lot of those steers were bulls. And this was, I was probably 10, 11, 12 years old. And they just crossed. And then we cut the bulls at home. And we cut their horns off and had to pull the shoes off of a lot of those cattle. They'd been driven so far, they'd had to have shoes that had been crippled. So those Mexicans shot those steers. And we didn't have any, and that's during the screwworm, okay? We doctored a few screwworms. I mean, everybody did that in those days. We didn't lose any cattle. Not like they're saying they do, but we didn't lose any. And there'd be 2 or 3 of us, just 2 kids, my brother and I, my older brother and I. He was 3 years older than I was 10, 12 years old. He was 13 or 14 years old. And then we had 2 men that worked for us. We took care of 4,000 or 5,000 cattle. We didn't lose any cattle. We didn't ever have over a 1% loss. That's death loss, stealing, and everything.
Yeah.
And the screwworm was during the heyday of the screwworm. Now in South Texas, they had a little more problem with it. Out here in Arizona, they had a little problem, but not that bad. I mean, people took care of it. I'll tell you, the economic impact from closing this border is going to be tremendously more than the screwworm, than the screwworm crossing to the livestock industry.
And there's been a short-term gain. Again, people have seen prices that have been at record highs, and ranchers have been able to sell cattle and really make some good profits. But now they're at a point where they are buying record high replacements. And so that profit margin is now extremely narrow. And as we look at this extremely volatile market, they're all sitting in a very risky position, depending on what direction this market goes. And so, we do have to step back and go, if we didn't have this intervention and we had to let the market handle itself, rather than having knee-jerk reactions to problems that producers can handle, what might have happened. And of course, I think it's fair to point out when we talk about the screwworm, there was not a reaction to the screwworm in 2016 in the Florida Keys in deer. There's a lot of cattle that come out of Florida and go to the Texas High Plains every year and wind up in High Plains feed yards. And so when you look at the movement of cattle from Florida across the southeastern U.S. and into Texas, they're very well could have been, an introduction at that point, but there was not the fear, there was not the reaction. So we have reached this point, as we saw with COVID, where we had these knee-jerk reactions to problems. We saw the same thing in the dairy industry with the reaction to bird flu. And so, we do need to be proactive. We need to be aware. We need to be good stewards. And that's why education is so important. But we also have to step back and look at what are the consequences of the actions across a broader market.
So I kind of have a follow-up question. For those who aren't really in our industry, the screwworm has obviously been here already back, 20, 30 years ago, or if not longer. But then you said that Florida's had it. So who do you guys know? Like, how many times has this been came across? But now all of a sudden, the government's making, they're doing this drastic change of they're closing the border down this time.
That's our question. We wonder the same thing.
We wonder the same thing, and we wonder if there's not some other alternative motive that the administration is trying to make another deal with Mexico or something. But that's one of our problems is that right now the USDA has no transparency. And that's not the way a public organization is supposed to work. They're supposed to be open to anybody that asks a question. They're supposed to answer that question to the best of their knowledge. Well, we don't get any questions answered.
And then, of course, what we do need to consider and what the general public is not aware about are the proactive measures that our neighbor to the south, Sonora, has put in place in response to this. And they've put measures in place with the, USDA's assumption that the screwworm's there, and it's not.
And I'll tell you, if that same thing happened in the United States, if we asked the U.S. rancher to do what we're requiring the Mexican rancher to do, the U.S. rancher would automatically just sell his cattle to town. There wouldn't be any more cattle in the United States.
They would just give up.
They'd give, they couldn't afford
So
it.
they've put out pheromone traps all across the state so that, if they do have active lights, they have traps, they can count numbers. Right now, they have not had any show up. They also do have an inspection point, cattle coming into the state.
Yeah, they're inspected twice in Mexico, and then they're inspected another time when they cross. These are supposedly the most inspected cattle in the whole hemisphere,
Right. And for years, there have been procedures in place for over 40 years that only cattle that are born and raised in Sonora are actually eligible for transport or importation into the import into the United States. So you can't have cattle from a southern state pass through Sonora, cross at the Arizona ports, and come into the U.S. Only cattle that are born and raised in the state of Sonora can be crossed. And then once they're presented to cross, they're held in quarantine pens. They are inspected by a Mexican veterinarian. They're inspected by a U.S. veterinarian, and they're dipped. And so, we have these very stringent procedures to ensure the safety of cattle coming in to the United States.
That is very well in depth of doctored cattle.
The difference in the price in Mexico and here, New Mexico, there's only a few people there that buy cattle, and their market is dramatically lower than it is here. In fact, we just sold some cattle in Mexico, and they brought like $1,500. They weighed 800 pounds. Well, that same animal here in the United States brings $2,500. Well, that's $1,000 a head difference, when 800. But
and this has hurt the Mexican rancher, just like, it's impacted, producers in the United States that work with Mexican cattle. And, they have lost the competition. And so now
we have to get back to this free market. Everybody talks about a free market. Well, in the livestock business, the more government interference we have, the less free market we have. And that includes every bit of whatever the U.S. government does, it takes away from that free market status.
So can I follow up with another question? And it kind of relates about stringent rules that Mexico has to follow. But you made a comment about of all the cattle that you guys cross, you're only retaining ownership or partial ownership on 30 to 40%.
That's correct.
On that remaining 60 to 70%, are you just acting as a broker in that situation? And then that kind of leads me into the second part of just, you know, um, and tell us how that works. How does a business transaction work between somebody on this side versus somebody on that side? You know, explain to us how business is kind of conducted.
Well, in our situation, we have people that's been with us for 30, 40 years, and they're in Mexico. They've been with us for a long time. We buy a lot of cattle we buy in Mexico. We take direct ownership of them, and we keep those cattle and get them ready. Partly, some of them we turn out on grass. It's been so dry though there hadn't been any grass, so we put them in these growing yards, and and then our people they bring them to town, and probably the cattle our people buy down there. We have one main buyer, and under him he has probably 15 main buyers, and then under those people they have another 15 or 20. A lot of these cattle we buy are bought from people that have 10 cows or 5 cows or whatever. Those people aren't necessarily hurt so bad in Mexico. It's the people in between that bought those cattle thinking that they're going to export them. Now, luckily, we didn't buy that many, but even the few cattle we bought, they actually didn't lose any money. They didn't make any money. And so we're at a kind of a standstill here. We thought these cattle have been way too high to buy. And the reason we say they're too high to buy is that when you go out here and try to contract them to a packer, well, the best you can do today is lose about $200 or $300 a head. So, and all these cattle have to wind up in the hand. I don't know anybody that, you can feed them and sell them yourself, but that really hasn't been very profitable.
Well, and so I want to take this actually back to one of the previous questions about what did the industry look like and what was border crossing previously like? I think that was a good question that might need a little more elaboration on. There used to be, there's only 2 ports in Arizona. There's Douglas and Nogales. And USDA is currently discussing potentially consolidating to 1 port, which is risky as well, because if you have an issue at 1 port that requires a quarantine, well, now all of a sudden we have no port. But historically, there was 6?
Well, not in Arizona. In Arizona, you had 2 at Douglas. You had one at Douglas and one right up the road there at Naco. And then you had another one here in Nogales. You had one at Saspe. You had one in San Luis. And all those ports were the same way in Chihuahua. When I first came down here with my dad many, many years ago, my granddad, when you went to Presidio, which is east of El Paso, a couple of 100 miles, those cattle were almost all driven in. And those cattle actually would bring a premium to the U.S. cattle. The reason they would is because of the age, because of the condition, and the quality. They were probably a little better than what we had here. Well, things have changed dramatically in the last 30 years. So therefore, the Mexican cattle, especially after cool, they become we discount them to the American cattle. But still, when they go to the packing house, they're not discounted. So if you run your cattle right, you have a little chance of making some money with them, but not necessarily everybody makes money. This business has been pretty risky. So especially these people selling these high-priced calves, if they want to follow them through the feed yard and then into the packing house, Mr. Trump, he'll really be excited when you have to have 260 or 270 for these fat cattle to break even. Now that would drive this price of this meat up.
Be disastrous. But again, if we don't have the cattle numbers,
that's where the price is going to be. I think we're going into a 2-tiered system. I think we'll have people that can afford to eat a steak and people that will never eat a steak, or very seldom, maybe once a year. And another thing is it on these imports of this beef, 70% of the beef in the United States is eaten in the form of hamburger. Well, if you don't have, I remember in the early 70s, I had a lot of cattle turned out and up in the Texas Panhandle on wheat. The cattle were big. And I mean, this business was really losing a lot of money. They bid me 18 cents on my yearlings. Well, I went to the bank was wanting me to sell them. And at that time, if I'd have sold them, I'd lost all my equity and I'd been $2.5 million in debt. And that's a lot of money in those days. Well, I didn't sell them. I fed them. And those cattle actually made a little money and I got part of my equity back. But that's how fast the market turned. And, but today, and in those days, I'd like to read, in those days you could find, we had 130 million beef cattle scattered throughout the United States, and you could find pasture anyplace. Today, with 35 million beef cattle, you cannot find pasture hardly to run these cattle. Well, why can't you? Well, it's because everybody says it's urban sprawl. Well, that's all baloney. These big ranches, they're a long way from any urban sprawl. And these wealthy people have bought these ranches and you can't, and they've held on to them and drove the price of the land up. You've seen it in your
Well, and one of the things that, of course, we mentioned, the big game ranches in some areas, those ranches no longer either lease pasture or have their own cow herds. In other areas, ranch land has actually been put under the Conservation Reserve Program. Now, that's a program that in some areas took farmland that was susceptible to erosion. And we think about the Dust Bowl and this drought that my dad previously mentioned. Moving forward, they looked at land that was very erodible and said, what, that needs to be conserved. So there was the Conservation Reserve Program for farmland. But then there was also conservation reserve programs for ranch land and grasslands. And so you took land that was once eligible for grazing, and once it's locked into a government program, producers, they're not going to let you double dip. You either get the program payment or you graze cattle and you get, the return on your livestock. And so a lot of these historic ranches, they have large acres tied up in these programs that are no longer eligible in some areas for grazing. And so, now we're reducing, more area for cow-calf operations. So, it's definitely a broad national problem, but definitely something that,
in my estimation, we have to get the government out of the cattle business and really out of all agriculture. And until we do that, we do not have a fair market system.
Right.
It's pretty controlled.
So can I go back just for a second? When working for Cooperative Extension, we had a national ag agents conference here in Tucson now 2 or 3 years ago, while they were still crossing cattle. We took all the agents that were from all over the country. We went down and watched them cross cattle on one of their crossing days. And you could look across the border, you could see the spotters and the guys on the other side of the line, and like I say, we had Border Patrol there talking to us as well, and it absolutely floored these people, blew their minds. And so I think a lot about that, we made the comment about education. I think that a lot of that goes back to just.
Well, that's one of the good things. That's one of the good things Trump did. He let Rubio go to the Mexican military. And I don't know what that cost. But you absolutely have nobody crossing that line now, illegally. Yeah. But they closed it from the Mexican side. We were not capable or able to close it from the U.S. side. But they closed it from the Mexican side in a matter of days. And today, we have a son-in-law that he's in this Homeland Security. He used to be with the Border Patrol. That's mainly most of those crossed right through the port of entry with a false identification. And that's all the way from Tijuana all the way to Brownsville, 23 people. Well, up until Mr. Trump got in, we'd have 53 people cross every night at each one of these ports. So that's just here.
Well, as I understand it, going back to the cattle, the cattle are ranked, are they not? There's coming from Sonora, are there different classifications? There's a kind of, I think there's like a class 1, class 2, and I don't know if it was a quality thing or what that was. Is that correct on the cattle side?
Well, you normally, the cattle when they cross, they're all mixed up. They weigh from 250 pounds to 700 pounds. Well, you'll size them for different weight groups, and then you'll also size them for different quality groups. You'll have a good number one steer, and then you'll have a 1.5 steer, then you'll have a number two steer, then you'll have a plain steer. You might have 5 or 6 different quality grades in that crossing. And so unless you have a place to go with all those cattle, it's pretty difficult to buy them. And that's where we fit in. There's a few of us that are capable of, well, we grew up with the business, we've been in the business a long time. We can dispose of all those different classes and sizes of cattle.
And what I think the general consumer does not realize is that those number one cattle, they're purebred animals. They're Angus and Black Angus, Red Angus, Charolais cattle. There might be some Angus Charolais crosses. These are really good quality animals. And so, of course, the Angus industry has done a really good job promoting Angus beef, but we can get the same quality of beef out of Mexico. And so there's this idea that it's a different animal.
Well, here's a set of cattle right here. They would just set a 1-1 as they weren't fancy cattle. They'd probably been 30% of them would have been from 1/4 to 1/8 crossbreds. And they were multiple colors, Charolais crosses, reds, blacks. These cattle made 800, what is it, 800?
Yeah, $3.50.
$803 a head. Now, they brought on the base trade here about 3 weeks ago, they brought 240. That's what they were bringing in the Panhandle. The very best animal out of Montana wouldn't have brought any more than 240 on that base. Well, by the time they finished with them, these cattle actually brought back 246. They yielded like 64.5. They graded like 88.5. They had no yield grade 4s, no yield grade 5s, and I think we got some premiums on something else. I forget what it was, but that's an enormous amount of profit. And of course, today, if they were sold today, that profit would be about $250 to $300 a head less than that. That's how much this market has actually came down in the last 3 weeks. Most people aren't aware of that. But this is the finished animal. And all these cattle that are selling at these sale barns, I don't care whether it's selling the country, selling on Superior, whatever, they all have to wind up in this packing house. And that meat is all sold basically at the same price, if it's the same type of meat. Now, one of the things these Mexican cattle have, they really don't have the genetics to get up there to 1,700 or 1,800 pounds because they're more of a beef animal. Here in the United States, especially in the north, we're raising another animal. It's not necessarily a beef animal, even though they're Angus. But if you take the DNA on that animal, they're probably it wouldn't be 30% Angus. The rest of it would be something else. Out here in our pens, Ron Graves sent us some cows from Benson. You probably know him. And he's got a bull over there. We weighed that bull. It weighs 2,300 pounds. I said, Ron, you got to get rid of that bull. You're going to hurt your cows. So, but that's just part of the industry. And this industry has cycles. I think we've probably seen the high of our cycle, unless the government gets to messing with it. Our industry, these fat cattle probably wouldn't have broke the way they broke if it hadn't been for Trump getting up there making that speech. I'm surprised that he didn't maybe fire some people for giving him that advice on what he said, but he didn't. I've heard maybe been fired. You know, especially when he talked about the meat out of Argentina. You know, Argentina, I think last year imported 2% of what our total imports were. Well, that's minimum. You know, that would have been 4 or 5 truckloads, maybe, or 10 truckloads. So that wouldn't be big. And he doubled that to 4%. Well, that broke the market, you know. And I think today, if he hadn't spoke, I think we'd still have cattle. We have less cattle today. They're actually fat than we had 3 weeks ago. But our market has came down dramatically. So that's another thing I don't know whether that's government interference or that's sure not free trade.
And what so many people don't discuss is that the livestock industry, just like other industries, it is an international market anymore. You know, our grains, they're traded on an international market. You know, what happens in Russia affects our wheat market here. What happens in Brazil affects our corn market. So we have to step back and realize, you know, we import a lot of beef. And by closing the border to live cattle, we're just, you know, really impacting that probably at a greater rate.
And we have to import more beef.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, the thing today, you know, our markets are so colluded. You know, for example, like corn today, you know, this corn's going up. Why would it go up? We had the largest carryover in history, and we have the biggest corn crop in history. And the price is going up. Not that supposedly China isn't buying it, but somebody's bought it. But that's a big secret.
Well, and to that though, yes, China, you know, they're buying some corn. They've also bought soybeans. And so, you know, this is definitely not about corn and soybeans. But what we also have to realize is that once we lose our markets, it's going to be really hard to regain that. And so while the U.S. imports beef, we also export. And there is a demand worldwide for quality American beef.
My wife is in Rome, and her and her sister, she has 2 sisters, they all went to Rome. Well, I can't imagine, but they ate at a steakhouse in Rome. Well, the steak that they ate it came from
Canada.
No. It came from that packing house in Kansas. Or eastern Kansas. I forget the name of the packing, but that's what she asked them to show her the box that steak came out of it, and that's where that steak came from. And what was so ironic about that, they bought that steak, a big T-bone steak, for not any more than it would cost you in downtown Tucson at Fleming's.
Interesting.
So
All the way over there.
yeah. So, you know, I don't know, you know, if we lose this free trade, we've lost a big part of our industry. And I think that's what we lost in the cotton industry. You know, back 50 years ago, we exported that industry. And now we're trying to grow cotton over here. What are we going to do with it, you know? They lost the USDA lost, 15 million bales over there in China. They still haven't figured out what happened to it. So what happens, you know? So I think this is a bigger problem we have today than just closing the Mexican border and the Mexican cattle. We're talking about free trade or no trade. And we're talking about a lot smaller industry. Now, the American rancher, when that industry starts retracting, you'll see these cattle going to town. You'll see these cows that they're holding back, these heifers they're making heifers, they'll send them to town.
And of course, there's again that broader impact, because if the industry continues to shrink, you know, there's less, I guess that our goods, all of our inputs, you know, become more expensive. You know, when they are able to, you know, make a lot of chutes, make a lot of trailers, you know, the price for the rancher is going to be cheaper. But with a smaller industry, the price of our goods is going to get higher. And that's another challenge. You know, when the president made the comment about record high cattle prices, one of the things that he did not consider is that the price of production is also at a record high. Just, all of our inputs and our infrastructure costs and the cost of equipment and tractors and trucks and trailers, there's when we consider those aspects, we're not necessarily looking at the same profit margin that people might have had, 60 or 70 years ago, even with a cheaper price. So we have to again step back. And so we lose a market, we have fewer numbers, fewer ranchers, fewer operators. Well, are the cost of our inputs going to get even greater?
And one of the things to really look at, when we were little kids, or granddads, or you knew people in the ranch business that had 100, 300 or 400 cows, that old man, he had a couple of employees and drove a Lincoln or a Cadillac. And today, if you had 300 or 400 cows, you don't have any employees, and you're gonna be driving a worn out pickup. So that shows you what, with all this government help. When I first came to Arizona, we used to feed a lot of cattle. My granddad and my dad used to feed a lot of cattle up around Phoenix. And I'll never forget this, we went out there out there by Stanfield. They had a it wasn't a country club, it was a club though, that all those farmers belonged to. And they had a poker game in that club. And it cost $10,000 to sit down that poker game. Well, that thing was just full of people. And today, I don't know if you could get any of those people to have $10,000 with all this government help. So I think we have to work towards getting the government out of our business, out of the agriculture business. And the people sure, a few people would go, but the people that stayed, I think, and the younger people, they'd have a chance to get back in this industry and make something of it. But it's going to be pretty tough if the government stays in this business, in my estimation.
We have an ag econ guy. His name is Dr. Russ Trump at the U of A. He has shared a graph where it shows the current beef prices, current and then the past decades. But then there's it adjusts for inflation.
Yeah.
And how years and years ago we were actually making more per head because inflation has gone so high. So I think
it looks to me like the more government intervention you have in an industry, the less that industry evolves.
Well, and I think it goes back to the key point that you kind of already made, is just the free trade. Let markets, leave markets alone, leave trade alone. But it's I think it's also hard when you have, and maybe this would fix itself, but you also have the monopoly on the packers side of things. So I think people are quick to say, "Hey, government, help us" in a situation like that, but it may have been caused by decisions that were made generation ago.
We talk about these being a monopoly. That's not really the case. Today we probably have more competition in the beef industry than we've had in years. And due to the fact that, look at them losing this money. If it was a monopoly, they wouldn't lose any money at all. They wouldn't, now they'll get back to being in a monopoly if the government keeps pushing, because they'll close enough packing houses that they'll finally, and then I guess I don't know what happens to us, but they'll get back to making money again. They're not going to sit there and lose this money forever. They'll close a packing house. If that doesn't work, they'll close another one. You remember what happened when they closed the Holcomb plant in Kansas? That was what, in 2017 or 18? Well, those fat cattle went down 40 cents a pound in 2 weeks. That went down another 40 cents in another 3 weeks. The price in the grocery store went up. So we need to be very careful on how we handle this business. And I'm all for having these other plants. But just like that friend of mine that has that small plant down there, they can kill about 500 cattle a day. My God, that never done nothing but lose money. And they handle the class of cattle does not hardly cost anything. But the few cattle that they've had to supplement their kill with, it's just taking all the profit away. And it doesn't matter what class it is, either fat cattle, cows, bulls, it doesn't make any difference.
Well, and I think one thing, while we talk about, of course, thank you, the current industry, I think it's also as we talk about Arizona, just kind of circling back to Arizona and why it's so important that we do all work together to maintain a viable livestock industry in Arizona, is that when we look at how the livestock industry has declined, we don't want further decline. We want to see the livestock industry for all of us grow and expand. And the population in Arizona is projected to grow. And so the livestock industry is in a position where we could grow with this growing population and provide beef to Arizona. It's been amazing to me to learn about the industry and historically the number of feed yards and packing plants that were from Tucson to Phoenix. And today there are not those feed yards. And there's Red Rock Feeding Company north of Tucson, and there's JBS Collison. But
then you have Pennell, and then you have
Yeah.
Collison. Well, then you have a couple little small yards around Phoenix. But my gosh, it's nothing compared to what it was 50 years ago, even 30 years ago. And it's gonna, and if we're not real careful, we'll lose Red Rock here. I mean, you can't stay in business losing this kind of money. And this border closed. I don't know what it's cost Red Rock, but I would imagine in the loss of tonnage in that mill, I imagine they've lost $2 or $3 million. And so, and that's going to go on if we don't straighten this thing out. But that's not just here. You're looking at the Panhandle of Texas. You're seeing probably 2 or 3 yards that'll close up there this winter. You can buy a feed yard up there for 10, 15 cents on the dollar. And the reason why is because, these cattle are too high, they won't work. You go to the bank, try to get financing, and this money's getting tighter. The reason it's getting tighter is because these cattle will not work. You buy these steers, you step out here and buy some of these calves, these $4.50 calves weighing 500 pounds, $2,100, $2,200 a head. Well, you're looking at a $600 loss. That's the reason money's going to dry up.
And that goes back to the point, yes, cattle prices have been high. People have been able to make some really good money, but once they're in a position where they need replacements, it's really hard to make
And
the
what
replacement.
the guy that bought those calves, what's he going to do? We said, well, you've got these future government again, you've got these LRPs, the government help you. Well, that's okay. But you don't know very many people that has really been successful in that business. Where you lock in all your costs and in our business, there's just too many variables. It doesn't rain, it rains too much, feed's too cheap, feed's too high. There's just too many variables.
I do have a question. Oh, sorry, Nate.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Sydney.
So I do have a question. From your many years of operation, do you have a price of what the cattle ran for that you made profit but didn't make too much profit or didn't lose too, have you seen the perfect number?
Not really. The what we try to do is when we buy cattle is for ourselves. We're sure we'll never buy cattle where you can't figure them to at least break even. And this last year, you couldn't have done that. And that's why when you put them on feed, we sold a lot of cattle that we partnered with a feed yard. And they financed the cattle. We used the futures. We cost $40, $50 to put the puts on there. So if the price went down, we weren't going to make any money. We'd probably lost a little money, but the top was left open. And the top just exploded. It went 30, 40 cents a pound, 50 cents a pound in our favor. But that's very, very unusual. That's the only time in my life I've seen that. And I think today, buying cattle at these high prices, I think you have just as good a chance at buying a lottery ticket. And that probably sounds kind of stupid, but not really.
Well, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, there's not much profit. You buy a cow for, at this market,
but what are you going to do?
I,
But people have made a lot of money. They've made an enormous amount of money. I'm not the only one that made these kind of profits. So they're going back and trying it again. They'll say, well, we're going to have a good market. Well, we might not have as good a market as we thought. You could see that from your futures today. Here just a few weeks ago, say your April fat cattle were at 240 to 246. Today they're 216. Well, that's a tremendous drop. That's $500 a head,
yeah.
you know. So in reality, you should take that $500 off the price of a calf, but that hasn't happened yet. It won't happen right now, but that will happen in the future. And and the most money I've ever lost is when there was no cattle on feed, and that was in the spring of '75. We had cattle in those days lose $1,200 a head.
Wow.
We fed them too long, and it was terrible. But the fact that they just drove us down to nothing. But then it came back awful fast. Under a free market system. And Mr. Harris in California, that's what really got him going. And then he bought a packing house, and it's all history from there. But we have to get the government out of our business, in my estimation. And I mean completely out of and that's tax wise too. Say, for an example, if you on this ranch, you run 500 cows, if you don't derive at least 85% of your income from that operation, then that ranch should be taxed as a recreational property. And that would get this industry back in the norm, where these young people could get in the industry and make a living. But today you see these permits out here. I tried to buy a permit, a forest permit here the other day. It cost me, they wanted $6,000 a cow unit. In my lifetime, a permit was never worth any more than just an average cow. Not a pair, but a cow. So today that, say if you give $2,000, $2,500, that'd be all that permit should be worth. But because you don't own that land. And, we've got these prices so high that it's going to be pretty difficult for a young man to get in.
Well, and
I think they have to even out. And I think they will. They will.
It makes me think, talking today, we're kind of coming up on an hour and a half, but I guess my question, and talking to you and hearing your story, and what makes agricultural producers, we're pretty resilient, and again, like we've talked about today, things have gotten tough and are getting tougher, and it's harder and harder to make a dollar in the industry. What drives you, Mr. Smith, to stay in the industry? I mean, because a lot of people. I mean, how many people do you know that are in your situation where once the screwworm deal hit again, it's like, okay, we're not going to do this anymore.
Well, the livestock, that's all I've ever known. That's the reason I'm still in the industry. A person asked me one time a few years ago, they said, "What, JZ, why didn't you go try to do something else?" I said, "Hell, I don't know how to do anything." And that's not, but that's one of the things we're losing too. We're losing people that can fix a car. We're losing all types of people here in the United States. We've exported those positions. And that's wrong. We need to get the government out of the industry. We need to get our government to run in the government and let the rest of these industries run themselves.
And I'll just kind of speak to that as well. I've had an opportunity to work with, farmers from Texas and interact with producers even beyond just through out-of-state contacts. And what I have seen, especially from the owner operators and even tenants, is that they are in ag because they do love the industry. They care about the industry, and it really does become a family business. I'm fortunate to be here to work with my dad, but I also have an older brother who has worked with my dad for over 30 years. And so people are in the industry because they do care about the industry, they care about the land, and they do want to see, continued improvement. And so I think it's important that we consider the impact. And again, people in ag not only care about their own enterprise, but it goes back to the community. And when you look at people in ag, people care about their neighbors, they care about their community, and it's not just a job. It really does become a life.
I would agree 100%. I think that's almost a crutch that we put upon ourselves as we love it so much that we do it even if it costs us a little money.
Yeah.
But these big companies, these corporations and everything, when I was a kid, all these feed yards, the cowboys, they'd own a pen of cattle or something, in partnership. Well, today that's not the case. There's hardly anybody working in those. They're working there just as a job. And in an independent, it's a lot different. They actually care about their neighbor, they care about this, but those corporations, they really don't. Those employees, they're just employees, and they really don't care anything about the neighbor.
Well, and not to make this a disagreement on the podcast, but then you go, well, why an employee? Why do employees go into the ag industry if it is just a job? Because I know just from working in ag, there's a lot of employees who can make better money elsewhere, and they can check out at 5 o'clock and they don't have to be there early in the morning to feed or go help fix fence when it's 30 degrees outside. It's because so many of the employees grew up in ag and they cannot afford to own their own operation. And it's because of the cost of living. When we look at not just the cost of production, but our cost of living today, it's hard for anyone to get started. So they go work for someone because they still care about the industry. They love the industry. Now, the thing is, it's the next generation. Their kids hate it, because their kids are the ones who it's like, sorry, I don't have the money for the extra pair of shoes, or you don't have the money to go on the school trip to Washington, D.C. because I work for someone in ag. And so those are the kids who no longer come back to ag. They go get a job elsewhere because they're the employee making, when it boils down to it, probably less than minimum wage.
But when we find, if we could ever see the point where we got the government out of our industry, I think then you'd see the young people coming back into this industry. Where these ranches didn't cost $2,000 an acre when they should be costing $80 an acre. Well, if it wasn't for the tax write-off, it'd still be back at $80, $90, or maybe $100. It'd go up a little bit, but nothing like they've gone up in the past. My granddad, he used to beat it to me every morning. I think that ranch of his up there, the only reason he bought that ranch in 1932, he'd been leasing it for many years, I think 8 or 10 years. But the original owners bought that land in the 20s. Agriculture was very great in the 20s, especially the ranching business. And everybody made a lot of money. And so you had a lot of these people that weren't necessarily ranchers to get into the ranching because they saw where that money was being made. Well, anyway, they sold out in the early 30s for $1.50 an acre. Well, it was way up in the middle 70s before we ever saw that ranch ever get back to, probably the early 70s, before that ranch land ever got back to $29. I know our ranch in northeastern New Mexico, my granddad bought about 20,000 acres of state land for $12 an acre in 1971. Well, today, that same ranch up there brings $3,000 an acre, which doesn't make any sense at all,
Yeah.
So we have to get the government and and that includes the tax benefits out of this ranching, unless you're a rancher. I don't know how possible that is, but I think that's what all of us, all the people in the business should work towards. And then we'd have a lot more viable industry.
I think that's a pretty good place to stop.
Yeah.
Viable industry. That's what we all want. Yeah, how do you guys feel? How do you guys feel about that? I think that was great. Anything else you want to add or want to touch on any more before we shut the recording off?
No, I just do need to make sure I do highlight that again. I'm here working with my dad and my brother, Jason Smith. So it's a great opportunity to be here with them both.
No, it's always fun, like I say, to see multi-generational.
Well, you'll have to come down and see us. We just bought a little ranch here a couple of years ago here near Sonoyta. And you'll have to come down and we'll have a carne asada.
Ooh.
I like that a lot.
Yeah, you both definitely. That'd be great. And hopefully the border will be open and
Well, hopefully they open the border up.
Yeah.
I can't imagine them if they keep it closed, it's going to impact our entire industry.
Yeah.
You'll see at least 2 to 3 packing houses closed because they can't stay open. You know, you can't expect these $7-8 billion plants to continue to stay open with nothing to kill, you know. So I think that you'll see it'll be a disastrous effect on the livestock industry if we don't reopen this border, I think. And you know, Mexico, they'll get along all right. You know, I think they'll probably you'll see if they don't open this border, you'll see the cattle go into Canada. I think next spring, I think you'll see those boats just go into Canada. And they have plenty of feed up there, and that's where they'll go. You know, they'll start buying the least cost animal, and then they'll take it to Canada. And I guess if we still have this problem with free trade, you know, Canada will take our markets away in the Orient.
Mhm.
And our export business is very, very important to the beef industry. I think they said it was 23 or 4 cents a pound. That's what they attributed the export business. So that's a big part of the profit of an animal.
And of course, it's those quality cuts that are exported. And people have to keep in mind, you know, again, my dad mentioned the hamburger. A lot of what we import, you know, goes into packing
That's all,
plants.
99% of it's all lean beef, you know, and
Yeah.
they grind it and it goes into this hamburger, you know,
Mhm.
and if we lose that, if we can import that meat, you're gonna lose. You go to McDonald's, you'll be buying a chicken burger.
Or a $25 hamburger at McDonald's.
Yeah, 25, you'll have a $4 chicken burger and you'll have a $25 hamburger.
I tell you, I got 4 little boys. For a family of 6, it costs us about $60 to $70 to eat at McDonald's.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
it's not cheap anymore.
Mm-mm.
And you know, I tell you something, I'm the one that has advocated for higher wages. You know, people have to make more money. When I got out of service, Mr. Payton, he knew I was coming back and he wanted me to stop at El Paso and see him. And I went to their meeting the week before he sold that plant to John Morrell. And he told him the people that worked at his plant, they were all part of the community. You know, they were on the school boards, they owned their own homes. They'd been there for 2 generations mainly. And those people, when they lost those jobs, I mean, they were lost. They never got them back.
That's a packing plant. So,
That's a
you know,
packing
again,
plant.
the value of the packing plant, Peyton Pack in El Paso.
And then pretty soon the packing house left. Well, that's part of big corporate restructuring, but it tremendously hurt, you know, farmland of America, you know, and that happened all over the United States. You know, Swift went out of business at Cudahy, Harmon, you know. But I think we could probably get part of that back if we can just get the government out of our business.
And it would be interesting, to get back to all those packing plants, to do a podcast on the history of the packing industry in Arizona. How many packing plants were historically here? And the number of feed yards. You mentioned, there's, Pinal, there's Red Rock,
Well, you've got JBS
or the Packer, but
but I mean, no, I mean,
their yard, yeah.
not JBS, Five Rivers now.
Yeah,
But Yuma, but Welton. But the first packing house in Arizona, nobody even talks about it, was at Bisbee, Arizona. And that was a cut-hay plant. And my grandfather used to bring cattle out of Kansas and bring them down there and they'd sell them. You had a better market in Bisbee, Arizona than you had in Chicago. Well, you could absolutely see that again with this new influx of people that are supposed to be coming into Arizona. But again, I think we have to get the government out of our business. I
Well,
don't know if that's possible.
I appreciate it very, very much. And like I say, it would be fun maybe once the border does get reopened to maybe have a follow-up episode where it's, hey, what's things look like for you now moving forward? Again, not the
Yeah.
government stuff's not going to change a whole lot, but just, hey,